Why does the avoidant keep coming back to the one person they can never fully handle? Why do they act distant but feel deeply pulled in? And why is it almost always the super empath who gets under their skin in a way no one else ever can? If you stay with this until the end, you will understand something most people never do. The avoidant is not confused by the super empath because they feel nothing. They are confused because they feel too much. There's something almost magnetic about this connection. It does not begin loudly. It does not always begin with dramatic words or obvious emotion. In fact, it often begins in silence, in eye contact, in energy, in the strange feeling that something deeper is happening beneath the surface, even when almost nothing has been said. And that is exactly where the avoidant starts losing control. Because here is what most people do not understand. The avoidant is not emotionally untouched. They are emotionally guarded. There is a difference, a very big one. They have spent years, sometimes a lifetime, learning how to survive by disconnecting from their own emotional needs. They learned that closeness can feel dangerous, that needing someone can feel like weakness, that being vulnerable can feel like losing power. So they built walls, not because they are cold by nature, but because at some point being open cost them too much. Then the super empath walks in, and suddenly those walls do not feel as strong anymore, because the super empath is not like everyone else. They do not just hear what is being said, they feel what is being hidden. They pick up on tone, tension, silence, shifts in energy, emotional contradictions. They sense pain behind pride, fear behind distance, longing behind detachment, and that is what makes them so powerful in the life of an avoidant. They do not connect only with the surface, they connect with what lives underneath. That is rare. And rare things disturb people who have spent their whole life hiding. You have to understand this deeply. Most people are easy for the avoidant to keep at a safe emotional distance. Most people can be charmed, distracted, or shut out. Most people do not stay long enough to touch the hidden parts. But the super empath does not only notice the hidden parts, they respond to them. Not with force, not with pressure, but with presence. And presence is dangerous to someone who survives through emotional escape. That is why the avoidant becomes fascinated so quickly. Not because the super empath is chasing them, not because the empath is trying to prove their worth, but because the empath naturally creates something the avoidant cannot explain: depth. And depth is where the avoidant starts to unravel. The avoidant may not say it. They may not even understand it themselves, but inside they feel something unusual when they are around the super empath. They feel watched without being judged, understood without having to perform, seen without having to confess everything. And for someone who has spent years hiding from emotional exposure, that experience is almost overwhelming, because being deeply seen can feel more intimate than being touched. And that is where obsession quietly begins. Not the loud kind, not the obvious kind, but the psychological kind. The kind that stays in the mind. The kind that lingers after conversations. The kind that makes them replay your words, your energy, your reactions, your silence. The kind that makes them wonder why they cannot stop thinking about someone they barely know, or someone they pretend not to care about. The super empath does not just attract the avoidant, they activate them. They awaken emotional material the avoidant thought was buried: old wounds, old fears, old needs, the need to be understood, the need to be accepted, the need to be emotionally safe, the need to be chosen without being forced to perform perfection. And when those buried needs start rising to the surface, the avoidant often does not experience that as comfort. They experience it as emotional exposure. And exposure feels threatening to a person who built their identity around self-protection. This is why the avoidant may seem strangely drawn to the super empath from the beginning. They may stare longer, stay close in subtle ways, watch more than they speak, open up in tiny moments, then pull back, test the connection, disappear and return, reveal a little, then shut down again. It looks inconsistent from the outside, but underneath something very real is happening. They are being affected, more than they want to admit, more than they can control. Because the super empath does something almost nobody else can do, they make the avoidant feel emotionally visible. And once someone has made you feel visible at the soul level, ordinary attention no longer feels enough. Surface level connections no longer satisfy. Casual interactions start feeling empty. Because deep down, the avoidant has already felt what it is like to be touched emotionally in a way they cannot fake. That changes them, even if they resist it, even if they deny it, even if they act like none of it matters. This is why the avoidant often becomes internally obsessed long before they ever become externally expressive. Their mind becomes full of the empath's energy. Their nervous system reacts to the connection. Their emotional world starts moving in ways they are not used to. And that movement feels both addictive and terrifying. That is the contradiction. The super empath feels like home, but home is unfamiliar to someone who has lived in emotional survival mode. So the avoidant gets pulled in not because they are ready, but because they are triggered in the deepest possible way. The empath represents something they secretly crave, but do not know how to hold. A kind of closeness they hunger for, but have trained themselves to fear. A kind of love that does not just make them feel desired, it makes them feel emotionally naked. And nakedness is hard for the avoidant, because once the mask starts slipping, they know they cannot go back to pretending they feel nothing. That is why this connection hits them differently. That is why they cannot just brush it off. That is why the super empath becomes unforgettable almost from the start. Because when someone touches the parts of you that even you have been avoiding, they do not simply enter your life. They enter your unfinished emotional story. And the avoidant may run from many things in life, but they never truly forget the person who made them feel what they spent years trying not to feel. That is only the beginning, because once the avoidant realizes how deeply they are affected, the real conflict begins. And what happens next explains why they can feel obsessed with the super empath and still be the one who pulls away. And that is where the pain begins. Because the moment the avoidant realizes this bond is no longer casual, something inside them starts to panic. What once felt exciting now feels dangerous. What once felt comforting now feels like pressure. What once pulled them closer now makes them want to disappear. Not because the connection became weak, but because it became real. This is the part that breaks so many people emotionally. The super empath feels the intensity and assumes it will naturally lead to honesty, closeness, and emotional commitment. But the avoidant often experiences that same intensity in a completely different way. To the empath, deep connection feels natural. To the avoidant, deep connection can feel like losing control. And control is everything to someone who has spent years surviving through emotional distance. So when the bond starts becoming more meaningful, the avoidant's inner alarm system turns on. They may not even understand why. Nothing terrible has happened. No betrayal, no obvious threat, no direct harm. But inside, their body starts reacting as if love itself is a risk. As if being needed is dangerous, as if being emotionally depended on will somehow trap them, consume them, or expose them in ways they cannot manage. That is why their behavior suddenly changes. They become harder to read. They stop expressing what they once showed naturally. They begin to hesitate where they were once open. They turn quiet when things become more intimate. They start creating confusion where there was once warmth. And the super empath feels every shift. That is what makes this dynamic so emotionally exhausting. The empath does not only notice words, they notice absence. They notice changes in tone, energy, timing, affection, emotional availability. They can feel when something is off long before it is spoken. So when the avoidant begins pulling away, the empath often feels the emotional withdrawal before there is any explanation for it. And that creates a wound of its own. Because now the empath starts asking painful questions. What changed? What did I do? Why did they get close only to go cold? Why do they look affected but act detached? Why does someone who clearly feels something behave like they are fighting it? The answer is difficult, but powerful. The avoidant is not always running from the empath. They are often running from what the empath awakens inside them. And that changes everything. Because once the connection reaches a certain emotional depth, it starts touching the avoidant's hidden fears. Fear of losing independence, fear of being fully known, fear of failing someone emotionally, fear of disappointing someone who truly sees them, fear of not being enough, fear of needing too much, fear of feeling too deeply and not knowing how to stay grounded inside it. Most avoidants do not have language for this. They do not sit down and calmly explain, I am feeling emotionally activated and my attachment wounds are surfacing. No, it usually comes out in much messier ways. Distance, delays, mixed signals, emotional shutdown, inconsistency, detachment, defensiveness, silence. And that silence can be one of the most painful parts, because silence from an avoidant is rarely empty. It is usually full of conflict they cannot express. They may miss you and ignore you at the same time. They may think about you constantly and still refuse to reach out. They may want closeness, then resent the vulnerability it creates. They may feel safest when you are near, but most threatened when they realize how much you matter. This is why the super empath often feels trapped in emotional contradiction. They are not imagining the bond. They are not inventing the depth. They are not crazy for sensing what is there. The connection is real. The impact is real. The emotional charge is real. But real feeling does not always produce healthy behavior. And that is one of the hardest truths for an empath to accept. Intensity is not the same as emotional readiness. Someone can feel deeply and still not know how to love well. Someone can crave connection and still sabotage it. Someone can be mentally fixated on you and still fail to show up in a stable way. And that is exactly what happens here. The avoidant gets close enough to feel the bond, but not stable enough to hold it. So they begin doing what their nervous system has trained them to do for years. They create space, not always because they want to leave. Sometimes because distance feels like the only way they know how to calm the storm inside themselves. But what they do not realize is that the distance they create often becomes the very thing that deepens the emotional damage. Because the super empath does not experience unexplained distance as neutral, they experience it as emotional rupture, as abandonment, as disconnection without closure, as love turning into confusion, and confusion is heavy for a heart that only wanted honesty. That is why so many super empaths stay emotionally stuck in these connections for far too long, because they can feel that something real exists underneath the avoidance behavior. They can sense the hidden care, the buried emotion, the silent attachment, the internal conflict. And because they can feel all of that, they keep hoping the avoidant will finally stop resisting and choose the connection fully. But hope can become a trap when it keeps you tied to someone who is emotionally unavailable in practice. And this is where human psychology becomes so important. When someone gives you moments of depth and then suddenly pulls away, your mind does not let go easily. It becomes hyper-focused. It wants answers. It wants clarity. It wants to solve the emotional puzzle. This is not weakness. This is how the human nervous system reacts to inconsistency. The uncertainty creates emotional addiction. The lack of closure creates mental obsession. The mixed energy keeps the bond alive in a painful loop. And that is why this dynamic can feel so intense for both people. The avoidant is overwhelmed by closeness. The empath is wounded by distance. One fears being emotionally consumed. The other fears being emotionally abandoned. And both end up trapped in a cycle that hurts them in different ways. But beneath all of it is one undeniable truth. The avoidant would not be reacting this strongly if the connection meant nothing. People do not shut down this hard over what feels small. They do not become this conflicted over what feels shallow. They do not retreat this intensely from what leaves no emotional impact. The problem is not the absence of feeling. The problem is the absence of capacity. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because if you do not understand that, you will keep personalizing someone else's emotional limitations as proof that you were not enough. When in reality, you may have simply reached a depth they were never prepared to sustain. And that is why the avoidant pulls away even when they are internally attached, not because the bond is weak, but because the bond is strong enough to shake the parts of them they have spent years trying to keep asleep. And once that happens, they are no longer just dealing with attraction. And that is exactly why this bond does not end when the contact ends. It lingers. It stays alive in memory, in emotional residue, in quiet moments that neither person fully talks about. The avoidant may step back physically, go silent, act indifferent, or move on in appearance. But inside, something often remains unfinished. Because some people leave your daily life, but never leave your inner world. And for the avoidant, the super empath often becomes that person. This is where many people misunderstand avoidant attachment completely. They think if the avoidant is not reaching out, then they must not care. If they are not expressing emotion, then they must have forgotten. If they are not fighting for the bond, then it must not have meant much. But human psychology is not always that simple. A person can carry deep emotional weight and still be unable to express it in healthy ways. Silence does not always mean emptiness. Sometimes silence is where unresolved attachment hides. The reason this connection becomes unforgettable is not only because it was intense, it is because it touched layers the avoidant does not normally let anyone reach. Most people interact with the avoidant on the level of personality. The super empath reached the level of emotional truth. That is what leaves the mark. There is a huge difference between being liked and being felt. Many people can be liked. Very few can be deeply felt. And once someone has been deeply felt, they are not easy to replace. That is why the avoidant may leave the connection but still keep carrying the emotional imprint of it. They may meet other people. They may distract themselves. They may throw themselves into work, routine, entertainment, self-protection, or temporary attention from others. But none of those things fully erase what the super empath awakened. Because once a person has touched the deeper emotional layers in you, surface-level connections start feeling strangely empty. That emptiness is what many avoidants do not know how to admit. They may try to convince themselves they are fine. They may act like nothing really happened. They may tell themselves it was never that serious, but their inner world often tells a different story. Because no matter how far they go, the emotional memory of the super empath tends to stay alive in the background. An emotional memory is powerful. It does not always show up as obvious heartbreak. Sometimes it shows up as comparison, as restlessness, as random thoughts at night, as checking without speaking, as wondering what the other person is doing, as remembering how safe, seen, or emotionally understood they once felt, as noticing that something is missing in every new interaction. That is what makes the super empath so difficult for the avoidant to truly move past. Not because the empath was perfect, but because the empath represented something emotionally rare, a kind of connection that did not require performance, a kind of closeness that reached beyond image, a kind of understanding that bypassed the mask. And the avoidant knows, even if they never say it, that those kinds of people do not appear often in life. That awareness creates a different kind of pain, because now they are not only dealing with loss, they are dealing with the realization that they may have walked away from something they cannot easily find again. And that realization can stay with a person for years. This is why the avoidant often keeps the super empath in a hidden part of their mind. They may not speak your name, they may not show obvious emotion, they may not come forward with direct honesty, but inwardly, they revisit the bond in ways most people never see. They replay conversations, they remember how you looked at them, they think about the things you understood without explanation. They return mentally to moments that made them feel exposed, alive, comforted, challenged, or emotionally known. Because some connections do not fade, they haunt, not in a dark way, in a deep way, in a way that keeps reminding a person of what they felt when they were briefly closer to their real self. That is why absence can make this bond feel even stronger. When the super empath is no longer available in the same way, the avoidant loses access to the emotional mirror that once reflected something important back to them. And once that mirror is gone, they often begin feeling the weight of what was there more clearly than they did while they still had it. This is one of the most painful psychological truths about avoidance. Many of them do not fully feel the value of the connection while they are still inside it. They feel it more after distance, after silence, after the emotional door starts closing, after the empath begins withdrawing their energy, after the reality of loss becomes harder to deny. That is when regret can begin building quietly. Not always dramatic regret, sometimes subtle regret, the kind that shows up in hesitation, in curiosity, in emotional restlessness, in the inability to fully settle into something new, because the nervous system remembers what felt significant, even when the ego tries to move on. And the super empath often becomes unforgettable because they activated significance. They were not just another person in the avoidance life. They became an emotional reference point, a standard, a memory of depth, a reminder of what real connection felt like before fear interfered with it. That is why so many avoidants keep circling back in small, indirect, confusing ways. They may not return with full maturity or clarity, but the emotional pull often remains. It can come out through watching from a distance, checking in unexpectedly, reaching out after long silence, or trying to reconnect when they sense the empath is finally detaching for real. Because when the super empath truly starts letting go, the avoidant often feels it. And that can shake them, not because they suddenly changed overnight, but because losing access to that energy forces them to confront what they could not appreciate properly while it was still close. Still, this is where the super empath must be careful, because being unforgettable does not automatically mean being valued in the way you deserve. A person can miss you and still not be able to love you well. A person can carry you in their heart and still not have the courage, healing, or emotional discipline to meet you properly. A person can feel your absence deeply and still remain trapped in their own avoidance. And this is why so many empaths stay emotionally tied to people who are internally attached but externally unavailable. They confuse emotional impact with emotional responsibility, but they are not the same thing. You can matter deeply to someone and still be mishandled by them. You can leave a permanent mark on someone's life and still never receive the consistency your heart needed. That truth is painful, but it is also freeing, because once you understand it, you stop measuring your worth by how openly someone can express what they feel, and you begin seeing the connection more clearly. The avoidant may never fully forget the super empath, not because the empath was loud, not because the empath forced closeness, but because the empath reached a place inside them that few people ever touch. And once a person has been reached there, they may walk away physically, but some part of them never fully leaves. And that is the truth most people are not ready to hear. The avoidant is not only drawn to the super empath because of who they are on the surface. The deeper pull comes from what the super empath awakens inside them. Not just affection, not just attraction, something far more powerful, something unfinished, something buried, something they spent years trying not to feel. That is why this connection can feel so intense, so confusing, and so impossible to forget. Because what the super empath awakens is not casual emotion. It is the part of the avoidant that still longs to be loved without armor. It is the part that still wants to rest. The part that is tired of pretending distance is freedom. The part that secretly wants closeness, but has never learned how to hold it without fear. And once that hidden part gets activated, the avoidant can no longer return to emotional numbness in the same way, even if they try, even if they distract themselves, even if they deny everything. Something has already shifted inside them. The super empath has already touched the place where the real story lives. And that is why the obsession is not always about possession. It is often about awakening. The avoidant becomes fixated because the empath represents something their soul recognizes, even if their patterns are still too damaged to receive it fully. The empath does not only make them feel desired, they make them feel emotionally exposed, emotionally understood, emotionally alive. And when someone has been disconnected from their own inner world for a long time, that kind of awakening can feel almost unbearable, because now they are forced to face something they can no longer hide from. The truth that they do want love, the truth that they do feel deeply, the truth that their detachment is not always peace, the truth that self-protection has cost them intimacy, the truth that they may have pushed away the very thing they always wanted, and that is where the real pain begins for them.